Chapter 16. It sure is creepy in here, Blackjack, Matt whispered as he and the old mule made their way further along the trail. The strange noises that they had been hearing were now followed by the rustling of leaves. He turned around slowly and was looking behind him when the mule suddenly came to an abrupt stop. Matt quickly turned in his seat to find two Indians standing on the trail before him. They were dressed in deerskin shirts and pants. Their long black hair fell down to their shoulders. One raised a tomahawk while the other held a bow with a long arrow pointed directly at Matt's heart. They didn't appear to be much older than Matt, but this didn't lessen his terror. For though they were just children, these Indian boys displayed a fierceness and a courage that Matt had never seen in boys before. Looking into their unblinking dark eyes, he felt the commanding presence of their strength. It left him feeling weak and soft and frightened. Matt found himself doing what he always did when he was truly terrified. He closed his eyes. He had never been able to watch a horror movie on TV all the way through without closing his eyes and asking Katie to tell him what was happening. There was no one to tell him what was happening now, so he just sat with his eyes shut tight, listening and waiting. Suddenly he heard some leaves rustling and more footsteps. Matt tried to squeeze his eyes shut tighter. There's more of them, he thought frantically. Probably a whole tribe. I'll never live to. Before he could finish his thought, he heard someone speak. Oh my gosh, doesn't that look like the chief? Came a voice from the bushes. Matt cracked one eye open to see the two Indians still standing before him. Then he opened the other eye to see Hooter looking out from behind the bushes. Hoot! Matt cried out loud. But on hearing this, the Indians thought he was giving some kind of war cry and they rushed the mule and pulled Matt off. No! Hooter yelled, jumping out of the bushes and coming to Matt's aid. Friend! He's friend! Hooter tried to explain. Hooter, I don't think I've ever been so glad to see anybody in my whole life, Matt exclaimed as the two boys embraced. You look awfully good to us, too, came another familiar voice from the bushes. Matt looked over to see Tony coming into the clearing. Tony, Matt shouted as Tony joined their embrace, and the three boys jumped up and down for joy, all trying to talk at once. Where's Katie and Q? Matt asked, looking back to the bushes. We've got some bad news, Matt, Tony began. Matt looked over to the two Indians. They had relaxed on seeing that Matt meant no harm. While they waited for the boys to talk, they were busy picking berries from a bush along the trail. Matt turned back to Tony. Katie, is she hurt? He cried. No, she's okay, Tony told him. Well, kind of okay, Hooter added. What do you mean, kind of okay? Matt asked anxiously. Why aren't you with her across the river? She's not hurt, Matt, believe me. This is what happened. Tony tried to sound calm. We never made it across the river last night. First, Adam Hibbs fell on his gun. The bayonet stuck him right in the stomach. They said he had never had a bayonet on his musket before. I guess most of the men haven't, and they weren't used to using them. Anyway, it was pretty bad. They didn't have telephones to dial 911 or rescue squads to take you to the hospital when you get hurt, Hooter interrupted. So, what happened next? Matt asked impatiently. Tony squirmed and continued to whisper. Then our boat hit this chunk of ice and started to go under, he said softly. Oh no, Matt gasped. It's okay, Matt, really, Hooter assured him. We were rescued by a flatboat that was crossing with some horses. They had to let the horses off so we could all fit on, though. That was horrible, to watch those horses try to swim. And then Adam Hibbs, well, he was bleeding so much. Hooter's voice trailed off, and Tony continued. Anyway, we came back to the shore with Adam Hibbs. We laid him next to a fire and told us to wait for him until they could get another boat to cross with. Hooter's eyes suddenly filled with tears. He was in a lot of pain, and they all thought he was hallucinating or something because he kept saying that he knew we were from another time. It was the same Adam Hibbs that was lost on the lake then, Matt asked. No, Hooter said. It was his grandson. Adam explained to us that his grandfather had told him this fantastic story all about traveling through time in a rowboat. His grandfather told him to look out for the old rowboat, and if there was anyone in it, not to be surprised if they were dressed in strange-looking clothes. I think he was really glad to see us and know that his grandfather was telling the truth. He was in such pain, though, that it was hard for him to talk, Tony added. It got so that he could only whisper, and so Q had to bend down to hear him. Most of the stuff about his grandfather he whispered to Q. Where is Q? And where is Katie? Matt asked anxiously. I'm getting to that, Tony winced. This officer told us to stay with Adam Hibbs until he came back for us. He went off looking for a boat, and then Adam closed his eyes and he never opened them again. We sort of just sat there waiting by ourselves. Then Katie saw it, Hooter interrupted. Katie saw what? Matt asked. The old rowboat, the one we came in, Tony explained. It was tied to a boat that had just come over from the other side of the river. The soldiers must have found it in the ice jam on their way across. We heard some officers talking about it, Hooter told them. They said the rowboat was too small to carry many men across, but that it should be saved in case they need it later. They told two soldiers to drag the boat into some bushes to hide it. You remember how you said Q was to be our brain? Tony interrupted. Well, he had this idea that we should find you and then all get back in the rowboat. He was sure from what Adam Hibbs told him that it could get us back home. So it sounded like a good plan, didn't it? He waited for Matt to agree. I don't know, I guess so, Matt said impatiently. Go on, what happened next? Well, I guess it wasn't such a good plan after all, because things didn't work out the way we wanted, Tony hesitated. Will you just spit it out, Tony? Matt pleaded. Okay, Tony continued. Since no one was really watching us, it was easy to slip away from the shore. The soldiers were also busy unloading the boats and forming into regiments. No one even missed us. We made our way into the woods just above the river. I scouted ahead of everyone. Yeah, about 3 inches ahead, Hooter smirked. Well, ahead anyway. Tony shot Hooter a smirk back. I don't think we should go too far into the woods and lose sight of the soldiers, he explained to Matt. Q's plan was to follow the soldiers from the woods and then catch up with you. But because of the storm, it was too hard to see where we were going, and before too long we were lost. It was a nightmare, Matt, really, Hooter added. We were all so wet and cold, and there was nothing around for as far as we could see but snow and trees. We were desperate to find some shelter. Matt knew from his own experience just how desperate they must have felt. Katie was beginning to cry. Tony continued. She wouldn't walk any further, so we found this big old hollow tree and put her on that. Q stayed with her, while Hooter and I scouted around for some dry wood we could use to make a fire. We hadn't gone too far when we heard them. He stopped and looked over at Hooter. Who? Matt cried. Heard who? The enemy. Tony told him. I guess it was the British, but they weren't speaking English. At least it didn't sound like English. They had these fancy blue and white uniforms on and big black hats that stuck way up on their heads. It almost sounded like they were talking in German. Oh my gosh, Matt humbled. The Hessians. See, Tony, I told you they weren't English, Hooter said. So what happened then? Matt wanted to know. Hooter and Tony looked down at the ground, too embarrassed to meet Matt's eyes. They carried Katie and Q off on their shoulders, Tony told them in a whisper. And you didn't try to stop them? Matt cried. Matt, they were huge, and they had these swords, Tony tried to explain. We started to follow them, but it was so dark, and we were so tired. We stopped to rest, and I guess we were falling asleep, and we were woken up by our friends over here, he said, pointing to the Indians. They saved our lives, Hooter added. They really know how to live in the woods. They made a fire and gave us something to eat. Hooter's voice had suddenly lowered. What is it? Matt looked from Hooter to Tony. Rabbit, Tony smiled. The Indians caught this little rabbit and roasted it over the fire. You know how Hoot gets about little animals? I keep telling him that his Big Mac was once a little calf. Tony smiled again. But Matt wasn't smiling. Did the Indians see the Hessians? He asked. I don't know. They don't speak much English, Tony told him. But the Hessians were on foot, right? Matt asked. They were pretty far into the woods to be able to travel on horses, Hooter said. And there weren't any around that we could see. Okay, then we know what we have to do, Matt said authoritatively. We do? Hooter and Tony replied. We have to find the Hessians and rescue Katie and Q, Matt told them. That's great, Matt, but just how are we supposed to do that? Tony asked. That's a good question, Tony. Now, if we only had Q here to give us a good answer, Hooter said, walking toward the Indians who were crouched by a bush. We can figure this out without Q, Matt told them. I'm the president of the club, and I think of something. Don't worry. He turned to Blackjack, who had patiently waited on the trail for him. Coming up beside the mule, Matt whispered in his ear, You wouldn't have any ideas, would you, Blackjack? But Blackjack just blinked his eyes and yawned. No, I didn't think so, Matt mumbled.